Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of the Paleoconnection. I am Verv and joined again am I with Brandon. We are here to discuss Black Lives Matter and Marxism. One of the things that we are commonly told these days is that if we believe that all lives matter, why can't we simply say Black Lives Matter? But just as the phrase, "it's okay to be white," comes with baggage, so does the phrase Black Lives Matter, as both things hint at a connection to something far greater. In the case of "it's okay to be white," it's clearly linked with white nationalism. And in the case of Black Lives Matter, it is linked clearly to far-left activism, and as we will cover here, it is also deeply connected to Marxism. Marxism is something that has always desired to capture institutions since the 20th century, when it became more clear that whatever victory Marxism would have in the West would look a lot different than how it took power in the East. The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci became a very popular figure for this sort of attitude. He is quoted as saying, "Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media, by transforming the consciousness of society." And it doesn't stop with Gramsci. The famous British commentator Peter Hitchens talked about how in the 60s there were actually calls for infiltration of all of the institutions. In a recent article in the Daily Mail, he wrote the following: "On a long ago evening, soon before the end of the Second World War, the leader of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Harry Pollitt, traveled to Cambridge to speak to left-wing students. He had a brusque, unexpected message for them. He didn't want them wasting their time selling the Daily Worker on street corners and going on rallies and marches. He didn't want them to become open communists. He wanted them to work their way into every corner of the British establishment and pursue the revolutionary cause. At that time, British communism was astonishingly popular. In 1945, it had 60,000 members and won 2 seats in Parliament, and very nearly won a third. Thanks to public gratitude for the role of the Red Army in beating Hitler, the Soviet Union was actually popular, and so was its political front organization in Britain. So Pollitt would have spoken to a large, keen audience. The astonishing Cambridge gathering is briefly recorded in Peter Hennessy's fascinating book, The Secret State. There's no doubt it took place, and the advice fits with the standard communist technique of urging key assets to keep their party membership secret. What we do not know is how many of Pollitt's eager audience took his advice," unquote. Hitchens also mentions that Pollitt also visited Oxford, though no specifics just read from there. But it's easy to imagine that Pollitt, and among other communist party members as well, would have advocated such a strategy to thousands, if not tens of thousands, of eager left-wing activists back then. So one doesn't need to be a conspiracy theorist at all to believe that Marxism is interested in a sort of political entryism, where it comes in and tries to grab influence in the institutions. It's something that they themselves have talked about and have advocated to their own party members. Any thoughts on that, Brandon?
Yeah, Verv, I think that's a great introduction. Basically, what I think, to try to condense what you were saying there, is that this basically, like Marxism, modern Marxism, is not your great-grandfather or your grandfather's Marxism, right? It has evolved. It has reformed. It's more gradualist. As we mentioned between ourselves, the Fabian Society is one example of an organization that uses gradualist and reformist approaches to spread socialism to the world. And looking at BLM itself, it appears that they seem to also be using this reformist, gradualist approach to make people, to kind of confuse people, to kind of pull the wool over their eyes. BLM talks about Black Lives Matter, of course, and that's what most people who don't look too much into the organization think about. But when we look at BLM's website and when we look at BLM's founders, we can get a better picture of what perhaps the true agenda is behind this organization. The three founders of BLM, Patrisse Cullors, who in my experience, she has been the most outspoken one. I've seen mostly videos with her online. But also Opal Tometi and Alicia Garza. All three of them are feminists. Two of them are self-avowed Marxists. Okay, so two of the three founders of BLM are Marxists. And as we're going to talk about a little bit later, just give direct quotes from them, this is not like a Marxism that they picked up when they were in college and they kind of dabbled in it and they kind of moved on from it. No, they still believe in it. It's part of their being. It's part of their entire outlook on life, on society, on everything, economics, on America, on the world. So it's hard for me to separate BLM from Marxism if the founders are Marxists themselves. And they still are Marxists. What do you think about that, Verv?
I think that's absolutely true. And I think that the only reason that Patrisse Cullors and some of the other co-founders are not really mentioned so much is because they are almost too obvious as Marxists. And so they've been told by a lot of the big influencers who bankroll it to basically take something of a back seat, even though, as we'll see, the website itself is pretty upfront about what their goals are, though a lot of this is not explicitly stated to be Marxist. I mean, if you believe in cultural Marxism, look no further, right? Their views, this concept of intersectionality, very much matches up with this old idea we see from last century of, what is a fellow traveler? This idea that you create these wedge issues, exploit them, and not even directly identify as a communist, and thereby gain influence over the culture by exploiting the wedges and concealing your true motives.
Yeah, exactly. And just to show exactly what Verv is talking about, let me read through a couple quotations from the three founding women of Black Lives Matter. So from Alicia Garza, co-founder of Black Lives Matter, quote, "It is not a coincidence that this iteration of the Black freedom movement is led by queer folks. It's not a coincidence, but that doesn't mean that it's any less challenging." So we can see clearly here with this quotation that it's not just about Black folks, right? We see this intersectionality philosophy being brought into BLM, where, as you said, fellow travelers, the LGBTQ community, and BLM seem to be very closely aligned together, out of the same, perhaps, goals for society. One more quote. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, and It would almost be fair to say that coming on the heels of the Obergefell decision and upon victory after victory of pretty much every major corporation out there actively signaling its support in Pride Month, it's now really the turn of the LGBTQ community to take on this next phase of Black identitarianism, for lack of a better word. Because, let's be honest here, the civil rights movement exactly won its goals in 64 and 67, And while some amounts of institutional inequality did exist, we really are looking at a completely different iteration of it that is far more radical than anything that was ever demanded in the 60s. Just as there's an apt comparison between, first wave, second wave, and third wave feminism, we could say that this is really a whole new iteration of black nationalism and identitarianism. But unlike these previous versions, it is really a lot more radical because it's very clearly aligned with the LGBTQ movement, as we'll see a little bit more from these following quotations.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Let's give some more of those quotations. So this one is from Patrice Cullors, another co-founder of BLM. She says, "My queerness, my blackness, my womanness shaped Black Lives Matter." So again, we can see with this quotation, it's not just, you would say, her blackness, right, that shaped Black Lives Matter. You would think that any person who, again, doesn't know much about this movement, they would think, okay, Black Lives Matter is just about black people, African Americans or black people around the world. But here she's saying that her queerness and her womanness are also what Black Lives Matter is about. Now, this doesn't make much sense, right? Because, the movement's supposed to be about black lives. So how does queerness come into this? What do you think? How does queerness come into it?
Theoretically, it shouldn't come into it much at all. That's not to say that such a movement would have to push out non-heterosexual black people. But Black Americans are quite a religious group of people overall. Certainly, some would claim that the religiosity among Black Americans is greater than that of white Americans. All of us have in our mind, the image of the fiery black preacher. Blackness and Christianity in America go hand in hand with each other. The fact that we have them here putting basically homosexuality as something far more important to Black Lives Matter than Christianity is very telling to me. It totally cuts out a huge segment of what you would expect would be the target audience for BLM, that is, black conservative Christians. Because if you really want a movement to be successful and to transcend partisan lines, you wouldn't make it so much about the controversial minority that might exist in your community, but you'd bring up things that would be more universal to the movement and not something that just panders to the left-wing black community that already does exist.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. The black community does tend to run conservative, and I even remember kind of a famous situation when the whole gay marriage debate was, more of a debate, and that was about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, when a lot of states were enacting or they had referendums for gay marriage. And I remember hearing in California in particular, where I believe they had a referendum that was, it originally the citizens of California voted no on gay marriage. And I remember hearing that a part of the reason why that was the case was because of the African American community was against it. And as you say, the stereotypical fiery black preacher, Baptists, Southern Baptists, African Americans are a very large community, and you have to wonder if they know about this queerness, kind of queerness smuggling into the movement.
Right. Another interesting thing to remember about that, I believe it was 2004 that this all happened. And it wasn't something where all of these conservative Christians showed up and you saw it reflected in other votes. No, the liberal candidates were still winning. The liberal causes were still winning across the ballot. It's just that I think it was Proposition 9, I believe it was called, completely failed because many of the minorities that showed up to vote Democrat, not just blacks but also Hispanics, voted against homosexual marriage.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I believe maybe, was it Prop 8? Wait, what's Prop 8? Was it Prop 8 or Prop 9?
That might have been.
Yeah, I think it was Prop 8. But yeah, exactly. Same thing with the Latin American community. They do traditionally, many of them are Catholic, run more conservative, at least socially. All right, let's go on to another quote. This one from Alicia Garza. Black Lives Matter affirms the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. So again, here we can see the focus on trans and queer folks, not just the Black lives.
And look at that with gender as a spectrum. This is something that feels like it's a very old idea because, time travels so quickly now in this kind of age. But if you were to go back to 2005 and suggest that gender is on a spectrum, there'd be almost nobody who would really sign up for that kind of statement. Very few people would affirm that. But in the year 2020, it's kind of like you almost don't even notice this. And, this is one of the most popular movements in the country right now, talking about how gender is on a spectrum. So something to think about there.
Yeah. Famously, in the universities, they're teaching that there's, hundreds of genders along the spectrum. I don't know what the number is up to these days, but the number is astronomically high. And yeah, you have to wonder why that is being stated in a Black Lives Matter movement. What does that have to do actually with Black lives? I think perhaps we can give one more quote here. This is from Patrice Cullors. She says, "We have to look at queerness as a means towards challenging normativity." Now, this one here really struck me because there seems to be, again, this movement going on right now where there's no normal, right? So the heterosexual or what they might call a cisgendered person, that is not normal, even though statistically it is normal. And it's what this quote's trying to do, again, is trying to break down what people believe, what people have believed since time immemorial, that there's, only two genders, that, the vast majority of people are heterosexual. It's sort of, they're taking from the playbook of the LGBT community, which it seems to have worked very well recently, as the media has really picked up and supported trans issues lately. It seems like they're kind of piggybacking off of this LGBTQ strategy and using it to further the Black Lives Matter movement. What do you think about that, Verv?
Oh, yeah. And it's interesting to me, this concept of challenging normativity, because when you think about it, in order for there to be blackness, there has to be a concept of what it is to be black, right? Because at this point, black is no longer just a color, just like white wouldn't be just a color. We're talking about, a culture, or a shared sort of identity, right? And what is a shared identity but for norms and values and kind of a sense of social cohesion? So, of course, I understand why, they explicitly reject some of these traditional ideas. They are trying to institute a lot of change, but saying that normativity itself is a problem is not going to be something that's easy to bring with them into the future. Think of the baggage of advocating this idea that which is normal is something that absolutely must be challenged. And, they're not talking about, this isn't some fifth grade teacher telling their kids here to, push the limit and try to act out in new and interesting ways and be yourself. We're literally talking about people challenging the very concept of masculinity and femininity and family itself.
Yeah, it kind of goes with the postmodern idea of, breaking down categories, kind of creating chaos, right? There is no normal, everything's subjective, that sort of thing. And your point about, well, if these categories don't exist, if there is a spectrum, then surely there's a spectrum of race as well, you would think, right? And that's one of the things I also hear a lot from liberals, like, there are no races, or, everybody's mixed. And if you look at your background, you're part black, and race is, a construct, that sort of thing. And I've heard that many times from liberals, but now here we have this idea of black people, And as you said, well, what is a black person? And I actually saw this question raised to Patrisse Cullors in an interview. Now, it was a softball question from a fellow traveler, but she actually didn't answer the question. What she said was, that's something that there's room for debate on, and we hope to talk about it in the future. So even one of the founders herself doesn't really want to say what black is, because really, they can't categorize certain people as blacks, because it really goes against their whole philosophy in general of categorization.
That's right. I've always found that you find these people really coming out the gates really hard when you talk about anything to do with identity, and they're like, oh, there is no white culture, or oh, white people don't exist, it's just a construct. But the second that you turn it back around on them and say, oh, so is there no black culture then? Is there no Mexican culture then? Is there no such thing as Latin American culture? Then they really start backing up quickly, because it's really okay for certain groups to have identity and have culture, and then it's only a negative if one group, white people, starts self-identifying as white, as having a culture and an identity, unless, of course, they're self-identifying in such a way that is explicitly negative. In a sense here, you see the mask slip, because they really aren't engaging with words in an honest way. They're using words as tools, right? It's not about establishing some universal concept of what is reality about culture and race. Culture and race are words whose meaning can change based off of how you want to use them. Words are basically tools.
Exactly. And of course, gender being the biggest one these days. But yeah, it's very hard for me to see how the movement can explain what a black person is. What are they going to say? Are they going to are they going to say that if you self-identify as black, then you are black? So that meaning like white people, what are those? What are the two famous?
Rachel Dolezal.
Yeah,
right?
Rachel Dolezal, and then was it Sean King, the guy he claims to be black, but there's a lot of evidence that he's actually white, because he had a white father and white mother. But how are they going to answer that question, right? Are they going to say, well, whatever you self-identify as? Are they going to say, well, it comes down to a certain percentage of blackness in your genes? It actually presents them with a very difficult question that I don't believe they can answer, and right. You haven't seen any attempt for them to answer it, because they know they can't, right?
Right. What's also interesting to me is this tool is kind of used when people discuss race, where they bring up edge cases as if the edge cases disqualify what something could ever be. For example, we know that if somebody runs the 100 meters in 10 seconds, wow, they're very fast. We know if somebody runs the 100 meters in 25 seconds, they're clearly not fast. But then you bring up a time like, let's say, 14, 15 seconds. Is that fast? Well, maybe that is fast for a 50-year-old man. That'd be probably pretty incredible. But is that fast for a 19-year-old who wants to join the college track team? Well, no, it's not. So they take these concepts of like the existence of groups that it's hard to classify. For instance, are Kurdish people white? Are they Asian? Is a Turkish person a European, or are they Asian? They come up with these sort of edge cases, and they say, because an edge case exists, we can't say what anything is. And it's not unlike saying, look, we don't know whether this picture of a woman on the beach in a thong is artistic or pornography. Therefore, pornography and art do not exist. That's how I feel they often treat these subjects, right? It's kind of, always.
And again, gender is the biggest one they do this with, again. Totally. And for example, if you say, well, of course, males are born with a penis and females with a vagina. Then they'll say something like, well, what about intersex people, or, hermaphrodites, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. I don't know what the exact percentage is, but we're talking about certainly under like 1% of people.
Right.
And because these people exist, and scientifically we have to kind of admit, they are kind of both because they have both genitalia. They try to extrapolate upon that and say, well, because that exists, well then again, gender is a spectrum.
Right, and something that's very suspicious to me is that you never hear about the percentage of transgender people who actually are born intersex. My idea on this is that if we were talking about a situation where something like 90% of the people who wanted to transition their gender were born intersex and were raised with a confusing situation like that, we would hear about that more, and it would be a lot easier to understand this. And I think you'd also find a lot of people who were saying, look, I was born with both male and female parts. I was raised mostly as a male. Now, in my adulthood, I've really learned that I should be female. Now I just want to be female. But there's this whole concept of being trans and how transness itself seems to even be the end goal of people, not simply transitioning fully into the gender that they identify as.
Yeah, exactly. Douglas Murray, the British conservative, talks about this. He himself is gay. He talks about how, if the trans movement actually moved steadily and more moderately, and like you said, if we found out that the majority of trans people were born intersex, we would have sympathy for that. But instead, what has happened is they just no, you need to accept a man with a beard who declares himself as a woman. That's what we're being pushed. That's what's being pushed in front of us, right? Not the person born with two genitalia that had a rough childhood that transitioned later in life. It's you need to accept the man with the beard who says he's a woman. And again, it's just going to the extreme edges of the reality, and it's just not, it doesn't pass the smell test to the average folk.
That's right. It really tells you that the real goal isn't actually allowing people who are born with these issues to quietly transition and live their lives as their adopted gender. The real goal is the deconstruction of gender itself, and to put a man with a beard in front of you wearing a dress and say, how dare you not affirm this as female?
Exactly. And if you're male, how dare you not have sex with this man or woman, whatever you want to call it. That
right.
in itself is also discrimination, right?
Right. And that's why you have the attacks on normativity, and as I understand it from the Black Lives Matter official website, even attacks on the nuclear family.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let's shift over to the official BLM website. So to our listeners, you can go to the website and you can see all of these quotations on there. As Verv just mentioned, the nuclear family structure is something that apparently Black Lives Matter does not like. Quote, we disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another. Now, the first time I read this, instantly there's some words that jump out. Collectively. Of course, famously, socialist societies love the collectivization of certain industries and agriculture and so on and so forth. And you can see throughout the BLM website, you can see kind of nods to the old Marxist ideas and Soviet system. What did you think when you first read this, Verv?
Well, it would be one thing if they attacked the nuclear family from a truly traditionalist perspective, where we're talking about, some guy who's basically Amish or a traditional Catholic or someone who looks to pre-modern civilization as being better than modernity, attacking nuclear family structure in the sense that it produces atomization. But this isn't the case at all. We're talking about, as we've already covered, people who believe that heteronormativity and transgender and gender deconstruction are goals. The goal here isn't a return to a wholesome, traditional, extended family structure, but rather the destruction of what we understand as conventional family ties. And so it's not going to be something where it's talking about a return. That'll be something that they might even try to spin it as if it became too controversial. It's something where we're literally talking about, I'm seeing hints of potentially them moving towards something like polyamory, right? It's more like saying you can have as many spouses and moms and dads as you want, and less about saying, hey, we want grandma and grandpa to live with us. We want 3 generations living together, right?
Yeah, and it's about the state stepping in, and I assume, based on what this says here, collectively caring for another. This is, I assume, the state stepping in and helping provide assistance for child rearing, either through money or through physical care of the children, and then of course what goes along with that would of course be state propaganda and whatnot. If collectively the state is helping you take care of your children, then of course collectively they're also teaching your children. And what are they going to be teaching your children? My guess is as good as yours, but it's probably some more of this Marxist BS.
And this totally opens the door for them saying, hey, we all collectively raise the children as a society. So what does that mean for you if the state declares that you are a bigot because you believe in things that they don't approve of? Obviously, it won't begin right away with taking a traditional Catholic or Christian family and splitting them up. But eventually, the goal would be that if you aren't actively affirming your child's gender identity that they were taught to embrace by someone in high school or whatever, then you might be declared a bigot. We've already heard stories about families in Ohio having their child transitioning to a new gender identity at high school without the parents being informed, and with parents walking on eggshells because they're worried about what they could be accused of if they aren't affirming the basically state-sponsored line on what sexuality and gender is.
Yeah, we know from history that anytime a state collectivizes whatever it be, education, agriculture, whatever it may be, that there isn't room for dissent. It's not like we're going to have some sort of collective village taking care of one another's children where, we have a Christian and a Muslim and trans folk and conservatives and liberals all doing that together. No, it's going to be, as you said, okay, this is what we need to believe. This is how we're going to do things. And if you disagree with it, then, funding will be cut or, in the worst cases, imprisonment, or your children will be taken away from you. Okay, let me skip to the next quotation from the BLM website. So, quote, "As a network, we have always recognized the need to center the leadership of women and queer and trans people." So here we have, again, a quotation from the website aligning with some of the previous quotations of the founders, that queer folk and trans people are going to play a center or a major role in the leadership of BLM. Verv?
That's right. And what you see here that's kind of interesting is that Black Lives Matter is supposed to be about centering, the black community. But even within this movement, it's not just enough to be black. You need to have the credential of being female or non-heterosexual or transgender to really distinguish yourself. So we're starting to see this concept where however you score on the intersectionality scale, that is where you will really place in the BLM movement. And while we don't really see it that much yet, you can really expect to see it in the future, that the amount to which you fit into multiple categories of being oppressed is how high you'll really be allowed to rise in these sorts of communities.
Yeah, the organization, as we've mentioned already, is at the top. The founders are sort of like the intersectional superheroes, right? Black queer women, right, or black trans women or man, right? They're sort of at the top of this intersectional hierarchy, and it also makes me wonder, what about conservatives? Do conservatives have any room in this BLM big tent? If you're black and a conservative, are you, let's say you support Black Lives Matter, will they find a space for you in their movement, or will you be pushed out? Is your blackness more important, or is your political thinking more important?
Right, and so you've got bona fide, excellent black leaders who are preachers, who are involved in the church. Some are even female clergy who just really aren't going to have any position whatsoever in this movement, because the movement is front-loading the gay identities and basically forcing everybody else to sacrifice their roles for these intersectional identities. If this was truly a movement that was just about black lives and how they matter, it would not be something that so obviously alienates conservative black lives.
Yeah, exactly. All right, another quote. We foster a queer-affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual. Now, this to me was a weird one because, I mean, even your most ardent conservatives would admit that some people in the world are homosexual. Now, some might believe that they're born that way, some might believe that it was a choice, but to say in this quotation that all in the heteronormative thinking and that all in the world are heterosexual, nobody actually believes that I know of. So it seems like they're setting up a really strange straw man here to take down, kind of trying to again go to the extreme edge of thought. You know, perhaps there is some extreme conservative that thinks this, but the vast majority of people do allow room for homosexuality, that it exists. Now, your thoughts about what it actually is and if it's, you know, a good lifestyle to live might be different, but you can at least admit that they exist, right?
Right. It's condemned in both the Old and the New Testament. You find references to it in, I'm not sure if it explicitly is referenced in the Quran, but I believe it's at least referenced in the Hadiths because they have clear prohibitions against it. Every culture, this is almost one of these talking points you actually hear the gay movement bring up, the fact that incarnations of homosexuality and even transgenderism tend to be found in cultures all across the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing here is it says heteronormative thinking. So, of course, if the vast majority of the world's population is heterosexual, then wouldn't that mean that whatever heteronormative thinking is, wouldn't it mean that that is the norm? Right?
Right.
To me, it just doesn't seem like a very good argument on their part.
Sure. I mean, this isn't, perfect parallel, but when I was growing up and I was getting into punk music, I was very much aware of the fact that punk is not a normal mainstream cultural expression. It is a subculture. And that's kind of one of the allures of it, is the fact that you are basically being different. To desire for, say, everybody in the world to be punk almost kind of would defeat the purpose of it. Once upon a time, I actually still know who this person is. I still talk with them. I have a gay friend who once shared this idea that he was telling me that in the gay scene, they kind of did look down on some of the activists, particularly people who are a bit older, because they're so obsessed with gaining the affirmation of society. It's almost like it's irrelevant to them how their own community can exist as a self-contained thing, right? Like, real gay people shouldn't be concerned with what the bulk of people think. Obviously, they don't want to be abused or bullied. I mean, nobody wants that. But this concept that you need all of society to affirm your life choices, it's kind of like selling out. Just as such, the idea that someone who is a punk rocker or someone who is into anything that is a minority position, needing the affirmation of the world, kind of, it's pathetic in its own way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like your punk analogy. Actually, Milo Yiannopoulos, who is famously a gay conservative provocateur, he says the same thing about being gay. He says that, part of the allure of being gay to him and many gay people is that it is sort of an underground movement. You're on the edges of society. You're doing things that other people are against, and that sort of feeds your desires and your passions and whatnot. And he says, if everybody's gay, well then what's the fun in that? What's the point of it? That's not what being gay is all about. It's supposed to live on the edges of society. Once it gets mainstream and centered, where gay people are marrying one another, it's not fun anymore.
Exactly.
All right, let's go with one more quote here from Black Lives Matter. It says, "We do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege and uplift black trans folk, especially black trans women. We engage comrades with the intent to learn about and connect with their context." Now, I admit I was quite laughing hysterically when I actually saw comrades
right
in the website. As I was saying before, there's these subtle or not so subtle, connections back to, traditional Marxism in the Soviet state.
Exactly.
And you have to wonder, this couldn't have been just, well, which word are we going to use? Comrades. That fits, right? It was purposely chosen, right? I mean, it was purposely chosen for a certain reason.
It's one of those things. So there's always that funny discussion where, a comedian will come out and be like, well, how long is it going to take for, the Hitler mustache to be normal again? When can we start growing that again? And, it's kind of this joke that one day, 150 years from now, just some random guy will have it and no one will be like associating with Hitler anymore. And it's not like they're doing that, right? It's not like we're going, well, we just think it's about time, communism's dead. We can all say comrade again. I don't think that's the case here.
Yeah, not at all. All right, let's shift gears a little bit to academia. What do you think about that?
Excellent.
So as we mentioned in the opening, one of the strategies of neo-Marxism is to kind of infiltrate the institutions, and there's no other institution that I know of that has been infiltrated more than the American universities. Now, this is actually backed up by data. This isn't just something we're pulling out of our asses. And we will provide that table in the YouTube video. And if you look at this table, now the one thing about this is it's from 2006. This table that will be, so it's a little bit old. But I have seen some more recent surveys that do show the same percentage of Marxists in the social sciences. But when you look at this table, you'll see basically what it is it was a survey done for American professors of the science, physical and biosciences, social sciences, humanities, computer science, health sciences, business, and other. And it asks them what their what their political stances are. And the three choices on this chart are Marxist, activist, or radical. Now, you can see a huge difference here in depending on what department these professors are in. If they're in the social sciences department, an astonishing around 18% of them are considered Marxists, and 24% of them consider themselves radical. Now, in the other sciences, the numbers are much lower, 2% or below, but humanities is also quite high, in my opinion, at 5%. Again, if you think Marxism is a dead philosophy, to have 5% of professors who still consider themselves Marxists is quite a surprise. But of course, the social sciences is the biggest one to talk about here, and it's also very important because the activists, the political activism that's done on college campuses is not done by the hard sciences or the comp sci departments. It's done by the humanities and social sciences departments usually. So if most of the activists come from the humanities and social sciences, and we have around 18% of them being Marxists, in my opinion, that's a huge problem. What do you think, Verv?
It absolutely is a major issue because it's like there's no diversity of opinion whatsoever. It'd be one thing if this wasn't something that was actually being reflected in the opinions of college graduates and the student body, but it very clearly and obviously is. All the numbers across the board pan out that way. There's also lots of other reports out there that show that when you look at a sociology department and just take 100 or 200 of them, the number of people who self-identify as conservative is next to zero. The few that identify as anything remotely close to that are all libertarian type conservatives, right? Something has basically been done where conservatives are pushed out of social sciences.
Yeah, exactly. And I believe the official number for conservatives is 5%. 5% of for social scientists in the United States are conservative. So, in conservative, of course, right? 50% of the nation, about if we go by the Republican-Democrat divide, about 50% of America would consider itself conservative in some way or another.
That's right.
But we have only 5% of social scientists who consider themselves conservative, and a larger number of 18% as Marxists. So there's a much higher percentage of Marxists in the social science departments than there are conservatives.
It's virtually 1 in 5.
Yes, so your chances of having a Marxist professor, if let's say you go through 4 years of university and let's say you take 3 social science courses, right, your chances of getting a Marxist professor are pretty high, right?
It'd be strange to not have one. And I'll also say this, that these numbers would just not be true in South Korea at all. I studied philosophy in South Korean universities, both undergrad and grad. And I was honestly a little bit surprised myself by the number of philosophy professors that I had that were actually quite strongly conservative. And some of the funnier aspects about this, honestly, was that some of the conservative professors that I had were also atheists, and some of the more liberal professors I had were self-professing Christians and Buddhists. There really was this sort of environment where, I imagine how it was in the very beginning of the 20th century in the West, where the people who were professors were rebels in many kinds of ways, right? They weren't necessarily fitting neatly into any category as, oh, this is a Christian conservative, or this is someone who is a free thinker and a liberal. You would find the person who's the free thinker conservative, and you'd find the Christian liberal just as often as you would find the Christian conservative and the atheist liberal.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you're talking basically there's more unexpected variety, whereas in the U.S. it seems like everybody has gone into their tribe and really just professes what they're supposed to profess from the tribe, like the talking points of the tribe. And just one more thing about this chart, this number 18% Marxist. As we were talking about before, fellow travelers, or let's call them Marxist adjacent people, you gotta imagine that the numbers of those, if you count, let's say, Marxist adjacent people who are sympathetic towards Marxism or who believe partially in Marxism, I mean, who knows what those numbers are in the social sciences or humanities, but they could easily get over to 25-30%, wouldn't you think?
Definitely. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. And the people who are in these departments are probably, at best, they're not concerned with the fact that the department is extremely biased. Because, I can imagine there's some apolitical type of people in these departments, but they're really not doing their job of representing some sort of balance. Because let's be honest here, I mean, yeah, I'm very conservative. If I imagine, though, if I was in a department where something like 90% of the other professors were either very conservative, or at least apolitical, I would almost feel some kind of burden to be more fair to the liberal perspective, because you would just worry about your students who are liberal, whether or not they feel welcome in the community, and you would also worry about whether or not the conservatives themselves will have an accurate concept or idea of what liberalism is. But when the shoe's on the other foot, I mean, you're just not really hearing about concerned, neutral, or liberal professors trying to be fair to the conservative opinion.
Yep, that's a very good point, Verv. All right, what do you say we run through a couple questions here before we finish?
Sure, and one more thing. It's not actually in the numbers we have here, but something that you'll hear a lot about is how theology departments have actually been captured by outright liberals, left-wing activist liberals, very famously Union Theological Seminary. But even when they're not explicitly captured by people who are advocating a left-wing political perspective, we're finding that bastions of traditional conservative theology are falling to people who are more likely to say things like the resurrection of Christ didn't actually happen, or that the New Testament texts themselves are not that reliably transmitted. We're basically finding a situation where even when the influence of the left isn't explicitly political, it is denying conservative Christian teachings in these seminaries.
Yeah, very good point there. Okay, so as I mentioned, we'll finish up the show just kind of going through some quick fire questions related to Black Lives Matter. So, Verv, I kind of was thinking about the Black Power fist the other day because I've been seeing it quite a lot on the news and in the media. And of course, this Black Power fist can have many meanings, whether it be, a struggle or, solidarity with one another. But I'm starting to kind of think that there's a bit more to it these days. What do you think about the use of the Black Power fist?
I think that in the very beginning, when it was pulled out, I believe, by the Black Panthers, and it was very much inspired by some event in the Mexico City Olympics in 1968 where two sprinters were on the... Yeah.
They had black gloves on and they held their fists up in the air on the podium.
Right. And so that period in time, segregation, America's version of apartheid, was still very strong in the memories of people. And so, there was a bit more of a context for this. We also had the issue of, the Vietnam War was going on. I honestly support the Vietnam War in retrospect to this day. That's how recalcitrant I am. But, you can imagine, though, that, like, at this time, this sort of kind of militancy, like, it's something that's much more understandable. The fact that they're bringing it back, it's kind of like, why would you take such a obviously... controversial and potentially militant symbol and try to revive it? What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think, as you said, the context that it was used before was sort of, again, fighting for obvious obvious problems in the civil rights period that existed, especially in the South. And I saw it as more of a solidarity thing. But the way I see it now is it almost seems like they want to be separate and equal again. And you're seeing this in many different. There's many examples of this. I've heard reports of certain universities that are thinking about separating, white students and black students into different dormitories. You have, of course, the famous Evergreen College incident in Washington, where they had a specific day where white people were not allowed to come to school. And we have in the news these days the NFL announcing that during week 1 they're going to play the Black National Anthem. Now, this is not something I never actually even heard of before, but apparently the Black National Anthem is the song called "Lift Every Voice and Sing." Now, to me, what seems to be happening is almost like this desire to separate oneself from the larger community, like America, right? What are Americans anymore? Are we going to consider ourselves a white American or a black American? I thought we were on the path towards, again, all being Americans, all being, united. But it seems now that we all need to be separate again. And the Black Power fist, to me, symbolizes that separateness, like they still haven't bought into the American system. And obviously we can see that Black Lives Matter wants to change that system drastically. So to me, it's a bit worrying to see these days.
That's right. And you got to think about these things. A national anthem exists for a nation, right? And the idea, if you were to say in 1990 that blacks constitute a nation within the United States, or that Jews constitute a nation within the United States, a separate nation, right? That would literally be one of the most Nazi things anybody could say in the year 1990, implying a fundamental separateness between races in the United States. But we have really come full circle here in the year 2020 when this Black National Anthem and this concept of basically resegregating things in the name of recognizing these differences. It's really kind of the collapse of egalitarianism as it initially existed in the United States.
Yeah, very good point. All right, next question. Is it possible to openly be against the BLM movement and still maintain your job in today's environment? What do you think about that?
Well, we saw that in New York, where a school principal on her personal Facebook just not even denying the concept that Black Lives Matter and openly stating how not racist she is. She simply said that she doesn't trust this movement, and she lost her job. There was another guy who I believe worked at the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago who criticized BLM. If I remember right, he had a Scandinavian name, not like Scandinavian American, like his name was, Torkel Gunnlaugsson or something like that, like a foreign name. He criticized BLM from the perspective of, also from the perspective of, hey, I'm anti-racist, and this is what I think about the BLM thing. And, this guy doesn't have secret connections to some kind of white power group or anything, but he lost his job as well. So, I mean, we're really looking at a situation where I think to openly criticize it is really putting yourself in a position where you might be fired, particularly if you have any job that interfaces with the public a lot, like in education. Maybe if you're an insurance salesman in Oklahoma, you can have an opinion about this and your boss isn't going to fire you. But heaven help you if you have, Antifa get a hold of your public post on Facebook and they've decided that it is controversial enough, they will literally destroy the business you work for on Yelp, call them up nonstop, and try to get you fired.
Yeah, I can't really think of anything comparable to this because like you said, with the principal in New York or wherever that was in the Northeast, you could actually say, I believe Black Lives Matter. You could say that, but then say, but I don't support that particular movement or organization, and still be fired, right? So in other words, you have to support, it's mandatory to support a certain organization that exists. It's almost as if, like, I don't know, after the Civil War in the South, that maybe you had to support the KKK to have a job or something in town.
Sure.
It's almost like that type of situation, right? It's so strange and so, like, not un-American, really, that you have to show solidarity with a certain political movement to maintain employment.
Right. And I wasn't there, but I would love to look into it. In the 1950s, I just imagine that there might have been more political nuance. People were being blacklisted for being outright members of the Communist Party, right? But I imagine it was a situation where you could say, hey, well, you know what? I'm not a communist, but I do think we need more social welfare programs, right? Like, I imagine this amount of nuance did exist because, after all, unions and political advocacy did exist. The Students for a Democratic Society that were pretty transparently socialistic did exist. And they themselves did not allow communists in their ranks. I mean, this sort of nuance existed in American politics. But in the year 2020, you can't even criticize an organization. It's not good enough to signal against racism. You have to actively support this organization, or your job could be on the cutting block.
Yeah, and the other worrying thing about it, too, is that essentially the organization is of course, it's a leftist organization, and the Democrat Party is sort of right in lockstep right now with the BLM movement. And, of course, BLM as an organization can throw their support to Democratic candidates or liberal candidates. So essentially what we're having here is that you have to support a leftist organization that supports Democratic causes, or perhaps Democratic candidates or leftist candidates. So if you are of the opposite political persuasion, you somehow have to show your allegiance to that, which it's just totally absurd, right?
And you can imagine that 20 years from now, if there is a up-and-coming Democrat politician who's in his 50s or 60s, people are going to look at the records and try to see, what was this person doing during the BLM movement, right? Imagine if that gets more extreme, you could be looking at a situation where if you are up for a position to be a local judge and you can't prove that at one point you donated to BLM in the 2020s, people could say, how can we trust this guy? He's probably a secret racist because he didn't support the movement.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's go with one more question here. And like all recent liberal political movements, feminism, gay rights, do you think BLM will ever fade away when their initial demands are satisfied, or will they perpetually exist with ever more niche and unrealistic demands? And, we can, like I said, we can see this with feminism and gay rights, right? The movements never go away. They just continue to move to the edges of society and find, some, again, with the gay rights movement, right? These days it's trans issues. With feminism, in the West, it's about, rape culture, or like very questionable things that, a lot of times the statistics don't even show to be true. Right. These movements never go away. There's people profiting off of them. And basically, you think BLM is going to be the same way?
Oh, exactly. This kind of reminds me of Scipio Nasica, before the invasion of Carthage by Rome, actually said, in order for Rome to remain strong, we must not invade Carthage. The meaning of this being that if Carthage was conquered, the Romans would take on this character of Carthage and become kind of these merchant, decadent, wealth-oriented people. History basically proves him right in the sense that after Carthage is fully digested by Rome, it does become a more mercantile society that loses its martial character and virtues. So thinking about that, You could look at it this way. When any society becomes too successful and conquers too much, it begins to die. And so when you look at something like, say, feminism or gay rights, you have the very healthy demands. The demand that women are not abused, that women have access to the workplace, that women get to vote, that they get to be treated with the respect of sentient human beings. These are very basic demands that I'm sure both of us affirm. First wave feminism, right? And you look at the initial gay rights demands when we go back to the 70s and 80s, and we're basically talking about they want some amount of affirmation in society, right? But as these things really go too far and they become too successful, they start making the demands that become their own downfall. Basically, the revolution eats itself. They get enough rope and they hang themselves. They go way too far with it, and they become something that is irrational and self-defeating.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Kind of piggybacking off your Rome reference there, and kind of wrapping things up here. We mentioned before about the Fabian Society and sort of how Marxism has evolved, and it's trying to invade the institutions and use more gradualist and reformist movements to get the philosophy across. And I was doing some research on the Fabian Society, and they actually take their name from the Roman named Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, and speaking again about the Punic Wars and Hannibal. He was the Roman general who was squaring off with Hannibal, and of course in the Second Punic War, Hannibal was rampaging around Italy and trying to draw the Romans into a final battle, right, where he could just destroy Rome once and for all. But of course, Fabius Maximus was very smart, and he did not want to take on Hannibal. So instead of taking him on directly, right, he went after the supply lines. He was using hit and run and guerrilla tactics, and he would wait for favorable situations to attack. And to kind of wrap it up, I really believe that this is kind of what's happening here with BLM and Marxism in general. They don't want to take on society head on, right? Because that's just kind of a no-go. But we've talked about them invading academia. It's even, believe it or not, these days getting into law enforcement, right? Law enforcement, traditionally a very conservative institution. Now we're talking about defunding them, and we're talking about spreading the resources to the communities. So they're infiltrating and pecking away at all the institutions, and eventually, once they feel like they have enough power, they're going to go for the killing blow. And I don't know when that will happen, but hopefully not during my lifetime. Any final words, Verv?
That is all correct, and I believe we could have another episode down the line to specifically talk about these issues concerning institutions, whether it be the university or the church. There's actually lots of resources on the participation of communists in the Catholic Church, specifically some of them with the effort to infiltrate and undermine. So these are all excellent topics, and basically we all have to be weary of the person with ulterior motives. This used to, oh, there's my dog. I'll just leave it with next week we will talk about something else, but in the future I do look forward to discussing this, and I pass it over to you, Brandon.
Yep. Thank you, Verv. So those of you who have reached this point in the podcast, again, thank you for listening. If you have any comments and would like to interact with us, please leave a comment at the bottom of the video. If you have not already, like and subscribe, and we will see you next time on the Paleo Connection.